Welcome to From the White Pill Box, the podcast where we stomp on statism and find the white pills along the road to a stateless society. I'm your host, Mark Maresca. I'm the author of the Substack articles of the same name, From the White Pill Box, content specifically for the already red-pilled, libertarians, voluntarists, anarchists, people who've overcome the myth of statism or are close to it. It's easy for us to be black-pilled, to believe evil will win. That's where the white pill box comes in. There are real-world reasons to have hope. Let's get going. Greetings, all. Thank you so much for listening today. This episode will be part 21 of my series on the myth of authority. I want to make today's installment a summary of the whole series up to now. I'll be referring back to particular episodes, and the show notes has links to every installment in the series. This way you can easily click to get each one. Incidentally, when I do that, the number I give will be its place in this Myth of Authority series starting at 1. I only recently realized I was using several episode designation numbers in my titles, so to be clear, today I'll reference its actual number in this Myth of Authority series. I like being as clear as possible, so today I'll start off listing the terms I've used with brief explanations. And again, feel free to drill into the full details by reviewing the original episodes. Okay, as you know, the series has focused on the myth of political authority, the concept that links everything we've covered, like statism, being red-pilled, strategy, and the transition to a free society. I fleshed this out fully in part 1. First definition, the myth of authority is the false belief that the state is legitimate, that a ruling class of certain people have moral authority over the rest of us, that we're morally obligated to obey them. By the way, for shorthand, myth of authority, or even just the word myth, always means the myth of political authority. We're not talking, for example, about an authority in astronomy or the authority of an office manager. Now, understanding the myth of authority is the key that unlocks the libertarian anarchist problem. Internalizing it yields a bumper crop of insights, like how it psychologically makes us vulnerable to false assumptions, how it explains the red pill process, which, by the way, is exactly the process of overcoming the myth of authority, how understanding the myth's key role gives us perspective on libertarian strategy, and one of my favorites, it explains how the transition to a free society is the process of the erosion of the myth, and just how the transition plays out in the coming decades. Next definition, the state. When I speak in more general terms, I use the state, as we all commonly do, to mean the whole apparatus of government, federal, state, local, all of it. But I've also connected the term to the myth of authority in part 1 as well. So in that sense, I defined the state as the embodiment of the myth of authority. That becomes clear when we look at the cause and effect relationship from the myth to the state, which I'll get to shortly. And when I speak in terms of strategy or psychology, the state is actually that very, very small fraction of state employees I call the bullies. That's covered in part 12, where I break down the groups that comprise the overall state, which I'll do now. The enforcers. These are the police and military. They're the agents of the state who are personally armed and trained to use force to compel people. They have the legal go-ahead to use physical guns. The suits. These are mostly politicians, but also high-level bureaucrats, judges, prosecutors, etc. Anyone in the state who, though not personally armed, has the legal ability to dispatch an armed enforcer whenever they want. The bullies of the state are simply the enforcers plus the suits. Anyone in the state who has the power of a gun available to either use personally, which is the enforcers, or to call out an enforcer, which the suits can do. The bullies are a key group in this analysis, the key dynamic as the myth of authority erodes. And then there's the clerks, anyone else who works for the state other than the bullies. The clerks are the paper pushers, the admins, the supply people, HR, the IT staff, the cleaning crew, you name it. They're the overwhelming, vast majority of those tens of millions of employees of the state. Clerks are not enforcers because they are not trained and armed to use the guns of government. And they are not the suits because they don't have the enforcers on speed dial. They have no more power of the gun than you or me. Now, sure, collectively all their various little roles of power add up to a lot, but they can't pose a direct and personal threat to us, the way an enforcer or suit is allowed to. The term red-pilled. This was fleshed out in Part 3. To be red-pilled is to have overcome the myth of authority, to understand clearly that the state is illegitimate, that no person or group in the state has moral authority over the individual. Blue-pilled. I use this mainly to contrast with red-pilled. A blue-pilled person is still under the sway of the myth of authority. I use the term the majority, as we usually do, to mean the vast percentage of human beings. I distinguish the majority from the bullies of the state. In Part 3, I introduce the terms true self and false self. The true self. A person's true self is the part of them that lives by the non-aggression principle. For the majority, this is the case in their private lives. They not only run their private lives, but expect to run them. They do not tolerate the idea of having their private lives ruled by others. Here, they do not violate the consent of others, and consistently, they do not expect their own consent to be violated. It's another way of saying they don't want to be ruled. That's their true self. Their false self is their indoctrinated part. This is where the myth of authority lives, the part fogged up to critical thinking about the state. The myth acts as a veil in front of their true self. This is the part of their nature easily manipulated and duped. The environment. This is a very important term in this series, first introduced in Part 13. The environment is the overall sense of the myth of authority within the population. It's, so to speak, how the myth manifests itself in people's general behaviors. It's how the belief in authority plays itself out in actions. A common example is when people see something they don't like and instinctively cry out that there ought to be a law. We hear that a lot. Well, take all that sort of speaking and acting by the majority based on their belief in the myth. That's the myth manifesting itself in the environment. As we'll see, the environment is the whole ballgame for statism. It's what secured statism in history, it's what matters during the transition to a free society, and it's what helps inoculate a future free society from statism. The environment does all that. We'll get into that too. The transition. Part 11 kicked off the discussions about the transition to a free society. The transition is the events and dynamics of the changing status of the myth of authority. It's the period of time starting when the myth of authority is first seriously questioned. Then at any given point along that transition, the myth is the measuring stick of the transition's progress. As the myth erodes, the resilience of the state erodes. And the transition ends when the myth of authority is effectively dead, and thus the civilized world no longer tolerates government. The state is over and done with. Libertarian foundational work, also Part 11. This is the scholarly grounding for a free society. Legal theory, property theory, philosophy. It comprises all serious libertarian and anarcho-libertarian scholarship. This started in earnest in the 1970s and continues to this day. The 70s was when we saw the first solid intellectual work that explained how government itself is illegitimate and that the free market and indeed stateless societies are both moral and practical. Given its foundational importance, this is the one area where libertarians did step up to the plate and big time. Eventual free societies will not have to reinvent the wheel in areas like legal frameworks, private courts, private security, etc. Finally, there's the cause and effect of statism. This started right from part 1, and it was a critical thread throughout. In a nutshell, it explains how the myth of authority is the true root cause of the state. How it happens is as follows. The myth sits in the heads of the majority. Because of the myth, in their words and actions, people show that they want to be dominated. Across the population, this creates a general environment, one that basically announces the desire for rulers. It signals how favorable they are to being dominated. I call it a bully-friendly environment. And along come the bullies of the world, the people who want to dominate others. The hospitable environment makes them feel welcome. They are thereby enthusiastically placed in power. And there you have it. The myth gives you the state, cause and effect. It's a psychological cause and effect. The cause is in our minds. That's where the myth lives. But its effect, its symptom, lives out there, the state. That's why the state is the embodiment of the myth. It's an important insight. If you don't want the effect, the state, it may be helpful to understand its cause, the myth of authority, meaning you might want to work toward eliminating the myth because that strikes to the root of the symptom, the state. Unfortunately, the libertarian movement's goal, eliminating the state, has tactically focused only on the effect, the state, without ever really addressing the myth as the root cause. This cause and effect relationship between the myth and the state becomes crystal clear when we see how it plays out past, present, and future. I cover this in part 11, where I examine those 3 periods. At each stage, any potential bully finds themselves within the particular environment. How they act depends on how favorable the environment happens to be. I used a metaphor of the myth of authority as a huge sheet of glass with the majority holding it up and the bullies up there on top. The strength of the glass, the environment, is determined by the strength of the myth. Take the past, most of human history up until very recently, when the myth was bulletproof. Always a very favorable environment for the bullies, and the bullies are welcomed to cheering crowds. The result? Statism. Powerful myth ensured solid statism. A nice solid sheet of glass. Nothing for the bullies to worry about skating along up there. The next stage, the transition, starting about the time we're in at the present. This was covered in parts 14 and 15. Now we see the myth of authority showing signs of eroding, plus the coming decades with the myth losing more strength. With that, people's behaviors shifting accordingly and the environment in turn becoming less favorable for the bullies. The former sense of a bully-friendly environment slowly morphs into a bully-unfriendly one. Now the glass is cracking under their feet. As a bully, it's wise to factor in those cracks since that's what supports you. Their life calculations change, especially since there's options in the private sphere. So being a bully at all becomes less attractive an option in this environment. Who wants a career that comes with public indifference, disrespect, mistrust, ridicule? For the enforcers, specifically, their own additional problems like confrontation, possibly deadly, having to watch their own ranks thinning as things get worse. For the politicians, the suits, sure, the ranks may not be thinning, but the glass is still cracking. Their enforcers' ranks are thinning out, so they feel less safe. Plus, their propaganda outlets are crapping out, like media, public schools, academia. And finally, the future. In a free society, there is no myth of authority. No one indoctrinated into wanting political rulers. So, no actions that show they want to be dominated. The environment is not influenced by the myth at all. To any potential bullies, this environment is unattractive, unwelcoming. It's not conducive to statism. In fact, no myth, so no environment at all. No glass sheet. No support available at all to potential political bullies. Will there be people who want to dominate others? Sure, that's why I call them potential bullies. Only there won't be a society-wide environment that welcomes them. It's still cause and effect, except now no myth present as a cause, so no state as the effect. Okay, that's a decent summary of the terms and concepts I use in this series, along with a framework of its running theme. Now, the whole purpose of my Substack is to dispense white pills. So rather than recap the series in a bland chronological way, I thought it'd be more fun and interesting if I just make it rain white pills. And we'll still cover all the major points. And I might add, some of the white pills are decent contradictions of common libertarian assumptions we see out there. So to make it spicy, I'll mention those assumptions as we go. If we realize how wrong we can be, that things might actually be a lot better than we thought, it might give us perspective on what we can do better. So let's go. One of my favorite types of white pills are the ones that bring the state down to size, the ones that show its weaknesses. And there are oh so many of them. I especially like these because they demolish our preconceptions about the size and scope of the state, a real source of libertarians being blackpilled. I cover these in parts 5, 12, and 16. Let's dive in. You know that demoralizing view that the state is big and powerful and overwhelming? Nope. It's all overblown. The state is a fraction of society as a whole. It's vulnerable by simply being outnumbered. In fact, part 12 gives us a reasonably accurate assessment of the actual number of people in the state who really count. Not those tens of millions, like 90% of them, who are the clerks. No, you can't just lump them right in with the bullies, as if that DMV agent or county bookkeeper is a personal threat. Sorry, the clerks don't count. Plus, they tend to be unimpressive, so during the transition to a free society, do they really seem the type to militantly defend statism? No. This means the bully population, the people who do pose a threat, is much smaller than we imagined. Best count, in the United States anyway, is 3 million bullies. A pitiful number against 330 million. That's a white pill ratio we can all live with. A ratio of one person in authority over every 110 people. Right there. I want you to see the proof of the myth's power, how it alone makes that embarrassing ratio possible. The myth makes those 110 people expect rulers, want rulers, and willing to fund rulers. The myth at the root. That's what leads to the state we have. White pill, how few bullies there are. And about those bullies holding power over us, I wonder, what's the compelling, philosophical, intellectual, rational foundation of it? Oh, there is none. The white pill is that the state is anchored on nothing other than a flimsy, false myth, the myth of authority, making the state as vulnerable as any lie, vulnerable to being exposed. Plus, the state is logically weak. Its premises are self-contradictory, and I'm talking not one, but a host of flimsy contradictions. Check them out. According to the statist, the bullies are your authority, except for that darned free will. You choosing to obey makes you the moral authority, even though the bullies are the moral authority. According to the statist, authority comes from the will of the majority, because, after all, might makes right. According to the statist, authority is justified as long as you follow legal rituals, because it's all about following steps, not actually acting morally. The slave laws follow the steps, don't you know? According to the statist, morality, right and wrong, apply differently to the bullies because they can do things we can't. According to the statist, it's normal that laws differ from place to place, because I guess morality is based on location. According to the statist, people delegate the right to violate consent. Don't worry that they don't have that right in the first place to delegate to others. According to the statist, if a law requires you violate your personal morality, you should obey. You'd be praised as moral by doing something immoral to you. Yeah, that's the ticket. Again, I love how these contradictions just nakedly expose the state as foundationally weak. Now, continuing. The state is vulnerable to a simple messaging tactic. You can challenge the myth in a person's head by creating a dissonance between their true and false selves. In fact, it's the key that unlocks the red pill process. And this vulnerability of the state, the myth needs almost total population-wide buy-in to sustain it. Sorry, 50% or 80% buy-in is not enough. They need near total buy-in. Even a small dissident percentage threatens it. That's vulnerable. Not to mention an easily overlooked white pill. Clear thinking is kryptonite to the state. Now, parts 6 and 12 give us an obvious weakness and also one of my favorites. The state is not a thinking entity. It has no conscious point of view. It's mindless. So, it's clueless. It's incapable of strategically responding as the myth of authority erodes. It cannot strategize to defend itself against that very real threat. Okay, the state not even being able to see the threat of the eroding myth is a good jumping off white pill, leading to how much the myth needs to erode to reach a tipping point, a point where the environment is so inhospitable for the bullies, they are obviously going to find other things to do from now on. The state backing off, as I call it. I mentioned my analogy of the bullies living up there confidently on a sheet of glass, which forms cracks as the people below start waking up. When the environment, the cracks, get tangibly concerning, the bullies are incentivized to get off. But I needed an analogy that also visualized the amount of skepticism. I have an analogy I wished I had come up with earlier. Think of that tipping point of the eroding myth as a bucket about to overflow, a bucket we want to see filled with skepticism of the state. I used to think, like you I'm sure, that the only thing that helps undermine the state's legitimacy is getting fully red-pilled, getting fully over the myth. Only then does your cup of skepticism add to the bucket. Not till this series, though, did I realize the psychology is more nuanced than that. It's actually perfectly fine if a person is not there yet, but just getting skeptical of the state. Any degree helps. It adds to the bucket. Sure, it may only be a thimbleful, but multiply that by millions, and that's a lot added to the bucket. This gets fleshed out more fully in part 19, the white pill that skepticism of the state counts, regardless of its degree. You don't have to get people red-pilled fully. You just need enough total skepticism to fill that bucket, i.e., to make the environment of the bullies uncomfortable. And it's a white pill that it's happening today before our eyes, especially in the last few years. People today are plainly getting more skeptical, and they're doing it on their own, mostly without our influence. They're coming to realize that they're supporting parasites and they're tired of it. Good. Take the win. Every step toward getting over the myth of authority helps. And it's also a white pill when a libertarian black pill gets slammed down. Check it out. As I said, the bucket fills up regardless of the degree of skepticism of the state. Okay, then we can trash the assumption we need the population to become majority libertarians, that a free society needs a majority to understand the principles and become anarchists. False. Parts 5 and 19 cover this. It's not the number who have Rothbard and Mises on their bookshelves. You just need a good percentage of people skeptical enough to make the environment uncomfortable for the bullies. That'll do it. Part 19 does a deep dive on those numbers, and yep, even 10% of the people being highly skeptical of the state is likely plenty to make the environment tangibly inhospitable for the bullies. Since we're talking about the majority, that segues beautifully to the white pills about the majority. In part 16, I point out how libertarians can be schizophrenic about the majority. On the one side, trusting them as self-governable people deserving of a free society, but then also calling them economically illiterate, illogical, impediments to a free society. Okay, the reality? Check out parts 3 and 16. The majority already have a true self, their NAP-compliant part, and it's on our side, not the myths. That's the majority of people across their whole lives. So no, we don't have to change people's nature. They just have to get over that one myth, a myth that doesn't even have a hold on their natural true self. Sorry if this white pill challenges some ingrained assumptions, but we're wrong to fabricate this cosmic gulf between the majority being blue-pilled and getting them to libertarianism. No, the distance is actually short. It's their false selves coming out of a fog and meeting their true selves, who are right there at the ready. Yep, a nice short white pill distance from the fog to even the start of getting skeptical of the state. That white pill actually makes the majority our close ally. Also in part 16, I offer another reason the gap between the majority and us is short. Okay, sure, the majority all have a false self, indoctrinated to support government. But check it out. They're only loyal to the current local rulers, to one single government, their own. If any other government tries to dominate them, any of the 199 out of 200 governments in the world tries to dominate them, oh, there's no myth fogging up their mind. For them, all ruling classes on the planet are illegitimate over them, except they're fogged up about only one, their current local gang. Well then, they're just one ruling class removed from us. Boom, the majority, again, a close ally. Oh, also in part 16, libertarians like to complain how the majority passively follow statism. No argument, the majority do follow social trends, including statism, but they work in our favor as the transition to a free society plays out. When the environment gets even more skeptical, with people less willing to go to bat for the state, the majority get more passive about defending the state, less standing in the way of the myth eroding. And the cherry on top is in a free society. The majority stabilize it. How? Since there's no myth to follow, they will be immune from statism, and all passively. Again, the majority as an ally. So yeah, I'd say the majority is our Godzilla-sized ally. Then there's the assumption of free societies being hundreds of years or more in the future, a black pill guesstimate that gets no further thought, except in part 11, which mentions the true history white pill of how some major social evils have disappeared, and often quickly, like the end of slavery and the fall of the Soviet Union. Sure, when you're in the middle of them, they seem entrenched forever, until they're gone. All of these white pills are reasons statism can take the same path. Now, parts 13 and 14 cover one of my odds-on favorite white pills, that the bullies themselves have a direct role in the transition to a free society, because they are going to back off. Now, in retrospect, I should have found a better phrase, because backing off is not about them all suddenly crying uncle and running away. It's more of the state, the bullies, having less and less incentive to be bullies at all over time, becoming less relevant, less respected, feeling less welcome. They will gravitate toward choices outside of politics, choices that feel more hospitable. Politics becomes too unattractive as even an option, not to mention that their environment includes something else, alternative opportunities outside of government, other, safer things they can be doing in life. I mean, no one wants to clean toilets, right? That'll be how being in politics or law enforcement will feel. So therefore, just plain fewer of them, from being less motivated to keep their jobs or to take bully jobs in the first place. That's the gradual backing off, their long-term exiting from the stage. If the glass under their feet was nice and solid before, over time cracks are forming, leading to larger cracks. That's not very comfortable and enticing. What do? Back off. Well, then in part 11 is another white pill, I wanted to say controversial, but only controversial if you haven't listened to the series. It's this: the transition to a free society has begun. The myth of authority has started to erode. It's being questioned right now, and the technology exists to allow that process to take its course, taking us to part 16, where I review the transition status as of today. Lots of examples that suggest the myth of authority is starting to erode, and examples indicating the state bullies and their handmaidens like corporate media are feeling it. That hospitable, comfortable environment that made them fully secure in the past is showing signs it's getting less hospitable, and their responses are not exactly heroic. Part 15 shows a great example of the erosion, helped along by none other than the COVID overreaction. We know how the state and the establishment boldly lied and damaged society. Well, that only undermined their own legitimacy. A whole lot of people had that veil lifted, even if only a bit. It helped toward eroding the myth by adding to the bucket. And I might add, it validates what I said about the bullies responding to the environment. At the start of COVID, they sensed an environment where they could literally lock down the world, a world that permitted it. A few years in, though, the environment changed. They backed off, didn't they? Be honest, you know they'd have loved to keep it going. Well, why didn't they? Why isn't it still going on today? The environment, making it uncomfortable for them to do it anymore. And notice that since COVID, the state's efforts to scare us the same way aren't sticking. Climate, wars, you name it. They can't get that total buy-in anymore. How about the very decent white pill of watching a pillar of the state collapse in real time? The legacy corporate media is dying as we speak. Trust in them has plummeted, so it's getting harder for the state to propagandize. And this skepticism and mistrust includes the other state handmaidens like the medical establishment, academia, even celebrities. So we have the white pill trend that people are more trusting their own judgment. It's the myth of authority in the process of wearing thin. In the glass, holding up the bullies, those cracks getting more visible. Now, connected to that are two big picture white pills about the transition. Part 11 fleshes this out. For one, there's every reason the transition will be natural, organic, and more or less under the radar, and above all, peaceful. This image of a dramatic, violent revolution some libertarians predict is really just a fiction. If that white pill isn't enough, there's the time it will take to play out. I've seen predictions of hundreds of years or more. Well, actually, a timeline of decades is now far more realistic, as I explained in part 19. This is based on things like the degree of skepticism out there right now, the technology of decentralized media and education, plus the emerging of cryptocurrencies, all happening today. What other white pills about the transition are openly noticeable today? Part 15 serves up a bunch, like people realizing law itself is simply whatever the state says it is to fit the needs of the moment. Again, COVID was a great example of that. When people less trust government law, they less believe in its authority. How about this one? The politicians slowly getting scared. Just notice, they don't do challenging interviews anymore. They stay in these bubble-wrapped environments where they feel safe. Wouldn't you say that means they're uncomfortable everywhere else? Another white pill. Watch how they behave. Often they're not acting dignified, calm, confident, smart. No, they're looking desperate, petty, belligerent, childish, and for sure, like they make things up as they go. Plus the white pill in part 18, that recruitment is down for police and military. It recovers now and then, but the trend is down. Nice, because it's fewer enforcers, but also nice because the politicians will feel even less confident. And this white pill from part 17, the examples of outright defiance. Now that's in-your-face proof the myth of authority is eroding. And even better, to average people, seeing it helps normalize it. Part 16 reviews the Milgram experiments. we saw that, sure, the influence of authority is strong, but only by default. Instead, when we are among others who question authority, it shakes us out of blind obedience. This insight should shine a 10,000-watt spotlight on how the bucket fills faster as we see more and more skepticism, and how rapidly things can change after a tipping point is reached. Part 17 also gives us a simple but obvious white pill. Over time, people's choices widen, so there's more competition for their attention. Well, this means in the ranking of things that are important in people's lives, the state's importance will slip down the scale. Less attention, less regard for the state, so less reason to consider it relevant. And then we have the monster white pill potential of free, self-declared anarchist communities based on private property and non-aggression. Part 20 touches on this. It's a white pill because these are already being talked about and planned today. If the next decade see actual free territories emerge, it's the beginning of the end of statism. Seeing a real working example will do more than all the activism ever. Psychology gives us some nice white pills, like in part 3, where I explain how psychology cracks the code of statism, showing the cause and effect relationship of myth to state. And that itself leads to white pill ways we can think about strategy, like in part 6, showing how it makes a huge difference in messaging if we put a greater focus on striking the root, the myth of authority. The episode discussed a war room strategy, how in a war, the elite strategists systematically deal with the problem. They define their terms, identify who the enemy is, the nature of the enemy, its strengths, its vulnerabilities, their own strengths and vulnerabilities. They discuss risks, timelines, and they discuss exactly what success looks like. I don't think the movement ever really put that sort of effort into strategy, but this series has covered this from the start. And in part 2, since the myth of authority utterly relies on a mental fog to persist, the best strategies find ways to target that fog. Like in parts 5 and 11, where I review probably the most fundamentally mistaken assumptions libertarians have made since the start. They've assumed that strategies should focus on the state, making the state the center of attack, that we need to manage our way to a free society, control the path there with detailed plans to dismantle the state. We never realized the critical role of psychology and cause and effect, how knowing the myth is the root cause points us to the root goal of getting people free of the myth. Instead, we put exclusive attention on the effect, the state. And yes, we were right to hate the effect, the state, who among us doesn't, but that method made the process of waking people up highly inefficient. So little progress was made in the movement's first half-century. But better a white pill comes late than never. Knowing the root of the state is the myth of authority turns those assumptions on their head. It helps us see that focusing on attacking the state is like mowing your weeds. So it's a white pill to realize it's better to dismantle the root cause, the myth. You help do that by making sure in your messaging that the myth is attacked explicitly and often. I offered some white pill tips on thinking and strategy, like in part 4. We can clarify our thinking, for example, by substituting the word myth for a typical statist word. Do you hate the state? Then hate the myth. Instead of the proud law-abiding citizen, it's the proud myth-abiding citizen. The law enforcer is actually the myth enforcer, pledging allegiance to the what? To the myth. Instead of public servants, myth servants. Minarchists seeing a much smaller role for the state? No, a smaller role for the myth. You get the picture. Additional tips pertain to communicating with others. For example, simply exercising patience. As exciting as it was to get red-pilled, it is, after all, psychologically like coming out of an abusive relationship. It's a process that can't be forced. Also, to stop trying to replicate in others our red pill effect of denouncing the state without replicating in them the red pill cause. getting past the myth. And the tip of avoiding what we always seem to do, attack their false indoctrinated self. That's like trying to force a cult member out of a cult, or like trying to end the Santa Claus myth by blowing up the mall Santa. No, angering their false self doesn't work. I gave practical suggestions how to instead validate their true self. Let them know that part of them is in the right. Then help that true self see that their indoctrinated self is a victim of a myth that even their true self doesn't follow. This sparks the mind into confronting its contradictions. Cognitive dissonance is leveraged so they hash it out in their head. It's planting the right seeds. In Part 7, I cover the two categories of communicating, direct and indirect. Direct is speaking to their true self and speaking directly about the root, the myth of authority, staying on target regarding the myth. Indirect strategy disregards the true self and does not speak about the root. Instead, it addresses the symptom, the state. Metaphorically, indirect approaches throw puzzle pieces into people's minds and expect them to guess at the picture. Direct approaches show them the big picture and use puzzle pieces to support it. And while the indirect approaches can have value, they are, after all, indirect. And the result has been 50 years of less than stellar results. So in Part 9, I cover some guidelines for folding direct approaches into whatever your own style is. I cover how we can personally improve our efforts in both one-on-one conversations and audience-type messaging. Be sure to listen to that one if you're a communicator of liberty of any kind. Okay, I think you'll agree that was some list of white pills. The podcast is called From the White Pill Box, but maybe today's should have been called From the White Pill Warehouse. Anyway, that about wraps up my encapsulation of the series. The next episode or episodes will be more of a postscript or afterword to the series. For one, I thought you might enjoy hearing my reflections on what I learned along the way and how the series has been of value to me. And I'd also like to have a heart-to-heart with the libertarian and anarchist community. Take a few minutes and assess things. What could have been done better? What's been accomplished? Yeah, a heart-to-heart is in order. But until then, take care and see you next time. Many thanks to Substack for hosting my podcast and my articles. And thanks especially to you for listening. And remember, keep looking for those white pills